They were all there just minutes before. That is what the telegraph operator swore, his trembling hands still smelling faintly of oil and copper wire as he repeated the message for the third time, his voice growing thinner with each telling, as though the truth itself were being drained from him the longer it remained in the open air. The train had left Black Ridge Junction at exactly 11:42 p.m., delayed only briefly by a stubborn signal failure, its passengers accounted for, its compartments filled, its conductor in full possession of his senses and duties, its lamps burning steadily against the vast and indifferent dark of the countryside stretching endlessly beyond the rails. And yet, when it arrived at Millhaven Station at 1:03 a.m., rolling in with a low metallic sigh and a shudder that echoed like a dying breath, there was no one inside. No one.
The station itself was hardly more than a dim platform, a skeletal wooden structure with peeling paint and a clock that had not kept accurate time for years, surrounded by fields that seemed to swallow sound and movement alike, as though the land itself had grown tired of being observed. Only 2 men were present to witness the arrival: Samuel Croft, the station master, whose life had become so predictable that even his dreams followed a schedule, and Elias Boone, a porter who had long since stopped questioning the oddities that accompanied working nights in a place most people forgot existed.
They had expected the usual: tired travelers stepping down with stiff legs, perhaps a child crying, a suitcase forgotten, a brief exchange of words before the train continued onward toward the next nameless town. But instead, they were greeted by silence so complete that it felt unnatural, as though the world itself had paused to listen. The doors did not open. The whistle did not sound again. The engine hissed, but there was no movement beyond the faint flicker of gaslight through the windows. Samuel was the first to approach, his lantern casting long, wavering shadows that stretched along the train's iron body like reaching hands. And though he called out, first politely, then with growing urgency, there was no response, only the hollow echo of his own voice bouncing back from the polished surfaces. "Passengers," he said, louder now, placing a hand against the nearest carriage door. "We've arrived at Millhaven. You'll need to disembark if this is your stop." Nothing.
Elias joined him, his heavier footsteps betraying a reluctance he would never admit aloud, and together they exchanged a glance that neither could fully interpret, but both understood enough to feel a tightening in their chests. "Maybe they're asleep," Elias muttered, though even as he said it, the idea seemed absurd, because no train ever arrived this still, this quiet, this wrong. Samuel tried the handle. It did not budge. Locked. From the inside. That was the first detail that would later be repeated in every retelling, every report, every whispered version of the story that spread far beyond Millhaven. The doors were locked from the inside. Not jammed, not broken, locked. And yet there was no one within to turn the key. They moved along the length of the train, checking each door, each window, each carriage, their unease growing with every failed attempt to open a passage, until finally Samuel made the decision that would mark the moment everything shifted from confusion into something far darker. "Break it," he said. Elias hesitated only briefly before raising his iron hook and bringing it down against the glass of the nearest window, the sound shattering the silence with a violence that seemed to ripple outward into the surrounding fields, as though something unseen had been disturbed by the intrusion. The glass cracked, then gave way, falling inward in glittering fragments. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Samuel lifted his lantern and climbed inside. The air was wrong. That was the first thing he noticed. Not cold, not warm, but stagnant, as though it had not been disturbed for hours, perhaps longer, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The seats were occupied, not by people, but by their absence.
Luggage rested neatly overhead, coats draped over armrests, a hat placed carefully on a seat as though its owner had only just stood up and intended to return at any moment. A book lay open, its pages unmoving. A teacup sat half full, the liquid inside perfectly still. Everything suggested presence, recent, undeniable presence, and yet there was no one. Elias followed, his boots sounding too loud against the floor, his breathing shallow as his eyes darted from one detail to another, searching for something that might make sense of it all, something that might ground the scene in reality. Where did they go? He asked, though the question seemed less directed at Samuel and more at the empty air itself. Samuel did not answer. He was already moving toward the next carriage, pushing through the connecting door, his lantern revealing more of the same, more belongings, more signs of life abruptly interrupted, more silence pressing in from all sides.
Carriage after carriage, they found nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone had left at all. And yet, they were gone. All of them. Until they reached the last carriage. It was different. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently with the subtle movement of the train as though inviting them in. And from within came a faint sound, so faint that at first Samuel thought he had imagined it, a low, irregular tapping, like something brushing lightly against wood. He paused. Elias did not. Pushing past him, driven perhaps by a need to confront whatever waited ahead before his courage could falter, he stepped inside. The tapping stopped. The carriage was nearly empty. Only a few scattered belongings remained, as though this section had been less occupied than the others. But at the far end, near the rear window, something caught the lantern's light. A mark, dark and uneven, smeared across the glass. Samuel moved closer. It was not a smear. It was writing. Not ink, not paint. Something thicker, darker. Blood. The words were crude, uneven, as though written in haste or desperation, the letters jagged and imperfect. Do not follow. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. Follow what? He whispered. Samuel did not respond.
Because beneath the words, etched faintly into the glass, as though scratched with something sharp, was another message. One that was far more deliberate, far more precise. They are still here. The lantern flickered. For a moment, the shadows seemed to shift, not with the movement of the flame, but with something else, something deeper within the carriage, something that did not belong to light or darkness, but to a place in between. Elias turned. I think we should leave, he said, his voice barely audible. Samuel nodded. But neither of them moved. Because in that moment, as the silence deepened and the air grew heavier, they both felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not from outside, not from the platform, but from within the train itself. From the spaces between the seats, from the narrow aisles, from the unseen corners where the lantern's light did not quite reach. And then, faintly, impossibly, a whisper. Not a word, not a voice, just a sound, as though something had tried to speak and failed.
Elias backed away first, nearly stumbling as he turned toward the door, his fear finally breaking through whatever restraint had held him in place. And Samuel followed, his lantern shaking now, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as though resisting his departure. They did not stop until they were back on the platform. The train remained, still, silent, unchanged. But something about it had shifted, something unseen, something waiting. By morning, the authorities would arrive, bringing with them questions, skepticism, and a determination to impose logic upon a situation that refused to be understood. And the story would begin to spread, first as rumor, then as legend, then as something far more enduring, something that lingered in the edges of conversation and the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt. They would search the train. They would examine every inch. They would find nothing more than what Samuel and Elias had already seen. But they would not hear the whisper. They would not feel the watching presence. And they would not understand why, in the days that followed, the train... Elias backed away first, nearly stumbling as he turned toward the door, his fear finally breaking through whatever restraint had held him in place. And Samuel followed, his lantern shaking now, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as though resisting his departure. They did not stop until they were back on the platform. The train remained, still, silent, unchanged. But something about it had shifted, something unseen, something waiting. By morning, the authorities would arrive, bringing with them questions, skepticism, and a determination to impose logic upon a situation that refused to be understood. And the story would begin to spread, first as rumor, then as legend, then as something far more enduring, something that lingered in the edges of conversation and the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt. They would search the train. They would examine every inch. They would find nothing more than what Samuel and Elias had already seen. But they would not hear the whisper. They would not feel the watching presence. And they would not understand why, in the days that followed, the train...
And they would not understand why, in the days that followed, the train could not be moved. Not because it was broken, not because it was damaged, but because, as one engineer would later claim before refusing to go near it again, it felt as though something inside was holding it in place, something that did not want it to leave, something that perhaps had never intended for it to arrive at all. And long after the train was finally dismantled, its carriages taken apart piece by piece and scattered across different places, long after the station itself fell into disrepair and the tracks were abandoned to rust and weeds, there would still be stories, quiet, uncertain stories, of people who claimed to see lights moving through empty fields at night, of distant sounds that resembled the echo of wheels on rails, of figures glimpsed briefly in the dark before vanishing without a trace. And always the same unsettling detail. They were all there just minutes before.